You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It is Sunday, the 27th of October, 2024, and you're listening to episode 88 of The Observing Eye, coming at you live from the computer hell cabin. Every week we get psychological, philosophical, and all manner of introspective. I'm David, and this week we are about to embark on a fast-paced whirlwind tour through some of the most influential philosophical ideologies that have shaped human thought over thousands of years. Now, let me ask you, have you ever found yourself pondering questions like, what is the meaning of life? Is there a true reality, or is it all just in my mind? Or even, how should we organize society in a way that's fair to everyone? Well, I've got news for you. These are the same questions that have fascinated philosophers for centuries, and today we are going to tackle them all. In just 30 minutes, or thereabouts, I'm going to introduce you to the key philosophical schools of thought that have shaped both Eastern and Western intellectual traditions, from the ancient wisdom of Plato and Confucius to the mind-bending ideas of modern philosophers like Sartre, Nietzsche, and even some of today's most cutting-edge thinkers. Whether you're interested in politics, ethics, metaphysics, or the nature of reality, there is something in philosophy for everyone. Now, keep in mind that this episode is going to be a bird's-eye view. I won't be able to cover every single philosopher or dive into all the nuances of each ideology, but by the end of this episode, you'll have a good sense of the major ideas that have shaped how we understand the world and maybe even how we think about our own lives. So buckle up. This is philosophy at full speed. Let's start at the beginning, with the dawn of Western thought in ancient Greece and the origins of Eastern wisdom in China and India. Okay, let's get into the origins of philosophy, starting with ancient Greece. This is where Western philosophy, as we know it, really took root. In fact, the Greek thinkers of this era are sometimes referred to as the fathers of philosophy, because they were the first to systematically explore questions about existence, knowledge, ethics, and the nature of reality itself. Before we get to the big names like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, let's talk about the thinkers who set the stage for them, the pre-Socratics. These philosophers, like Thales, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras, were primarily concerned with understanding the nature of the cosmos. They moved away from mythological explanations of the world and started asking questions based on reason and observation. Thales, for instance, believed that everything was ultimately made of water, while Heraclitus thought that everything was constantly in flux, famously saying, "You can't step into the same river twice." These early ideas were revolutionary because they marked a shift from mystical to rational explanations of the universe. Now let's jump to Socrates, often considered the true beginning of Western philosophy. Socrates didn't write anything down himself, so most of what we know about him comes from his student Plato. Socrates is famous for his method of questioning, now known as the Socratic method, where he would engage in dialogue with people to expose contradictions in their thinking, pushing them toward deeper truths. Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living, and he spent his life questioning everything, from politics to morality to human nature. Unfortunately, his constant questioning led him to be seen as a threat to the status quo in Athens, and he was eventually sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and impiety. Then came Plato, who took Socrates' teachings and expanded them into a complete philosophical system. One of Plato's most famous contributions is his theory of forms. According to Plato, everything in the physical world is a mere shadow or copy of a perfect ideal form that exists in a higher, unchanging reality. So for Plato, every object we encounter, a tree, a chair, a cat, has an ideal version or form in this higher realm. In his view, Our world is a world of imperfect copies, and only by contemplating the forms can we understand true reality. Plato also founded the Academy in Athens, which became one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western world. And finally, we had Aristotle, Plato's student, who took a different approach to understanding the world. While Plato was more focused on ideals and abstract forms, Aristotle was deeply interested in the physical, observable world around us. He believed in studying things as they are, relying on empirical observation and categorization. Aristotle's work laid the groundwork for countless fields of study, from biology, ethics, logic, politics, you name it. He argued that everything has a purpose, or telos, which is its reason for being. For example, he thought the purpose of a human is to reason well, which forms the basis of his ideas on ethics and what it means to live a good life. His influence on Western thought is almost impossible to overstate, and his ideas shaped scientific and philosophical thinking for centuries. Now, while these Greek philosophers were establishing the foundations of Western philosophy, a completely separate but equally powerful philosophical tradition was developing in the East. We're going to start in ancient China, where Confucius was shaping a system of thought that focused on harmony, social roles, and personal virtue. Confucius didn't write about metaphysics or the nature of existence in the same way as the Greeks. Instead, he focused on how to live a good life within the context of society. He emphasized concepts like ren, meaning compassion or kindness, and li, which refers to proper conduct, rituals, and social customs. For Confucius, the ideal society is one where people know their roles, fulfill their duties, and live in harmony with each other. Alongside Confucianism, another influential ideology, Taoism, was emerging with Lao Tzu at its core. Taoism, as presented in Lao Yu's Tao Te Ching, emphasizes living in accordance with the Tao, or the way. Unlike Confucianism, which focuses on social harmony, Taoism encourages individuals to align themselves with the natural order of the universe. A central Taoist idea is Wu Wei, or non-striving, which suggests that we should avoid forceful action and instead let things unfold naturally. For Lao Tzu, wisdom comes from understanding the flow of life and not resisting it, like a river flowing around obstacles rather than fighting against them. Last but not least, let's head to ancient India, where Buddhism was taking shape under the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, otherwise known as the Buddha. The Buddha's teachings centered on overcoming suffering, and he outlined the Four Noble Truths as a framework for understanding and transcending the human condition. The core idea here is that life involves suffering. Suffering has a cause, there is a way to end suffering, and that way is the Eightfold Path, which includes ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom. Unlike the Greeks, who are largely concerned with the nature of reality and knowledge, or the Chinese, who focused on social and cosmic harmony, the Buddha's approach was more psychological, focusing on inner peace and liberation from the cycle of rebirth. So there you have it, a snapshot of the philosophical ideologies that laid the foundations for much of human thought. The Greeks gave us a blueprint for questioning reality, the Chinese emphasized harmony within society and nature, and the Buddha offered a path to personal liberation. From here, we're going to move into the medieval period, where these ideas begin to merge with religious thought, giving rise to new and rather fascinating developments. But before we do that, let's have a little word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Athletic Greens. No, it's not at all, actually. It's sponsored by me and my book, which is out on Amazon, and you can purchase it as a paperback or on the Kindle, and it sits very much alongside this podcast. So if you're interested in philosophy and psychology and ways that these ideas can be applied to our lives in general, then the book is a really great place to get some theory and some practical applications of it. The premise of the book, we go through a few different scenarios. We talk about authenticity, about gratitude, about letting go of stuff. And there's a lot of Stoicism, there's some Buddhism in there, there's all sorts of philosophy and theology that covers this stuff. And the end point of it is for you to be able to reflect upon yourself and whether you are living according to how you would want to live organically, or whether you've adopted all of these frameworks and ideas that come from the external. God knows there's enough of those that hit us every day. So if you're interested in the podcast, if you're interested in that sort of thing, some philosophy, some psychology, and some actual uses of them in day-to-day living, then go and buy my book on Amazon. You have to just search The Observing Eye, or I will put a link in the show notes for you to go and have a look at that as well. And I'm hoping that you'll find it useful. So yeah, go buy my book. Subliminal messaging. Buy my book. You will buy it. Yeah, but just see what you think. Or don't. It's entirely up to you. There's no pressure. I have no expectation here. It is out into the world and I have let go of it. So it is just there. It exists. And you may enjoy it if you so choose. Thank you for your time. And we now return to the transmission. Now let's step into the medieval era. The world of philosophy looked a little different here. Ancient thinkers like Plato and Aristotle laid the groundwork, but during the medieval period, philosophy was deeply intertwined with religion. This era saw the rise of scholasticism, an intellectual movement that aimed to reconcile faith with reason. Philosophy was no longer just about seeking wisdom for its own sake. It was about understanding the divine and exploring the nature of God, creation, and the human soul. One of the biggest figures of early medieval philosophy was St. Augustine, a Christian theologian who was heavily influenced by Plato. Augustine believed that the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom was ultimately a journey toward God. For Augustine, faith came first. He famously said, "I believe in order to understand." But he also saw reason as a gift from God, meant to help humans understand divine truths. Augustine's writings, like The City of God, presented a dual vision of existence where human life is divided between the earthly city, bound by human sin, and the heavenly city, guided by divine grace. This idea of a tension between worldly desires and spiritual ideals became central to medieval Christian thought. Fast forward a few centuries, and we come to another towering figure in medieval philosophy, Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was a Dominican friar and a philosopher who was heavily influenced by Aristotle's writings, which have been recently rediscovered in Europe through translations from the Islamic world. Aquinas set out to prove that reason and faith weren't incompatible. They were, in fact, complementary. His most famous work, Summa Theologica, is an enormous compendium that tries to systematically explain Christian theology through the lens of Aristotelian logic. Aquinas introduced what he called the 5 ways, 5 logical arguments for the existence of God. His thinking was that if reason is a part of the human soul given by God, then it should lead us to truths about God, not away from them. Aquinas' influence on Christian theology was so profound that his ideas remain central to Catholic philosophy to this day. During the same period, a remarkable intellectual movement was taking place in the Islamic world, where thinkers were blending Greek philosophy with Islamic theology. Key figures like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes not only preserved Greek philosophical texts, but expanded upon them. Avicenna, known as Ibn Sina, was a Persian polymath who drew heavily on Aristotle's ideas, especially on metaphysics. He developed complex theories about the nature of the soul and existence, famously arguing that existence and essence are distinct, which would later influence thinkers both in the Islamic world and the Christian West. Then we have Averroes, an Andalusian philosopher who became known as the commentator because of his extensive works interpreting Aristotle. Averroes argued for the harmony of religion and philosophy, believing that the Quran encourages rational inquiry and the pursuit of knowledge. He faced backlash for these views, but his work later influenced Jewish and Christian thinkers, making Averroes a bridge between Islamic and Western thought. His commentaries even found their way to Europe, where they inspired philosophers like Aquinas, creating a dialogue between faith and reason across cultures. In Jewish thought, we see a similar blending of Greek philosophy and religious beliefs, especially in the work of Maimonides, also known as Rambam. His seminal work, The Guide for the Perplexed, aims to help those who were struggling to reconcile faith with philosophical reasoning. Maimonides used Aristotle's ideas to explain Jewish theology, arguing that philosophy and the Torah were not contradictory but could, in fact, illuminate each other. Maimonides believed that through intellectual understanding one could come closer to God, thus making reason a vital part of religious life. His work would go on to influence both Jewish and Christian thinkers for centuries. Medieval philosophy was more than just theology, though. During this period, mysticism also became a powerful influence, especially in Christian and Islamic teachings. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart spoke about experiencing God directly through personal revelation, suggesting that divine truth goes beyond reason and can be felt directly in the heart. Similarly, in Islamic Sufism, mystics like Rumi and Al-Ghazali wrote extensively about teaching God through love, devotion, and inner knowledge. These mystics offered a different path, one that bypassed intellectual reasoning in favor of direct personal experience with the divine. So medieval philosophy is a bit of a mixed blend. It's a time when thinkers were trying to merge ancient Greek wisdom with religious faith, attempting to answer questions not just about the world, but about the divine and humanity's place within it. Whether through rational inquiry, theological doctrine, or mystical experience, they were all driven by the same goal: to seek understanding, to reach the divine, and to find truth. As we move out of the medieval period, we enter the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, a time of massive intellectual and cultural upheaval. These eras transformed philosophy by shifting the focus from religious doctrine to human potential, scientific exploration, and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. Thinkers during this period started to challenge the authority of the church and embrace ideas of individualism, observation, and reason, sparking what we often call the Age of Reason. So let's dive into some of the major philosophical developments that emerged during this time. We'll begin with the Renaissance, which was a rebirth of interest in ancient Greek and Roman thought. During this time, there was a surge in humanism, a movement that emphasized the value, agency, and dignity of individuals. Humanists like Petrarch, Erasmus, and Thomas More argued that human beings have inherent worth and the capacity for greatness. This was a big shift from the medieval view, which saw humanity primarily in relation to God. Instead, humanists focused on the potential within each individual to shape their own life and the world around them. This movement laid the groundwork for a more secular approach to understanding human nature. As the Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment, philosophy moved even further in the direction of rationality and scientific inquiry. This was the Age of Reason, and it produced some of the most influential thinkers in Western philosophy. One of the first major figures was René Descartes, a French philosopher who is often called the father of modern philosophy. Descartes famously declared, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. This phrase captured Descartes' method of doubting everything he could until he arrived at something absolutely certain: his own existence as a thinking being. Descartes was a rationalist, meaning he believed that knowledge could be gained primarily through reason and thought rather than sensory experience. Meanwhile, another group of philosophers known as empiricists argued that knowledge comes from sensory experience rather than abstract reasoning. Key figures in this camp included John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. John Locke, often considered the father of liberalism, argued that our minds are a tabula rasa, or blank slate at birth, and that all knowledge comes from experience. This was a radical idea because it suggested that people aren't born with pre-existing knowledge or inherent social roles. For Locke, human knowledge and identity are shaped by experience, which means we're all born equal with the same potential to learn and develop. This idea of equality also fed into Enlightenment political philosophy. Locke's theories about the social contract and natural rights, life, liberty, and property, became foundational to modern democracy. He believed that governments are legitimate only if they have the consent of the governed, and that individuals have a right to overthrow rulers who violate their rights. Fucking amen. These ideas would later inspire revolutions from America to France, as people demanded political systems that respected their freedoms. At the same time, we have Thomas Hobbes, who had a very different view of human nature and politics. Hobbes is best known for his work Leviathan, where he argued that without government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He believed that humans are naturally self-interested and that a strong centralized authority, a Leviathan, is necessary to prevent chaos. Unlike Locke, Hobbes argued that people surrender some of their freedoms to a ruler in exchange for security and order, forming a social contract based on self-preservation. And then we come to Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher who tried to bridge the gap between rationalism and empiricism. Kant believed that both reason and experience are essential to understanding the world. His critique of pure reason introduced the idea that while our knowledge begins with experience, the mind actively shapes and structures that experience according to certain innate concepts. Kant also developed his famous theory of ethics, based on what he called the categorical imperative, a moral principle that suggests we should act only according to maxims that we would want to become universal laws. In other words, if it's wrong for one person to lie, it should be wrong for everyone to lie. Kant's ideas would profoundly shape modern philosophy, especially in questions of morality, autonomy, and human rights. This era also saw the rise of social philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had a major influence on political theory and education. Rousseau argued that civilization corrupts natural human goodness and that the social structures we create often oppress individual freedom. In The Social Contract, he famously wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," suggesting that people must collectively agree on the rules and norms that govern society. Rousseau's ideas on direct democracy and the general will would become central to revolutionary thinking, especially during the French Revolution. And finally, the Enlightenment brought about a questioning of knowledge itself, a precursor to what would later become the philosophy of science. Thinkers like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton laid the groundwork for the scientific method, emphasizing observation, experimentation, and rationality over mere speculation. Newton, in particular, showed that the universe operates according to natural laws, which could be understood through mathematics. This idea that the universe is like a machine that can be studied and understood transformed not only science but also philosophy, as it led to questions about free will, determinism, and the nature of knowledge. So to sum that all up, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were a time of huge change. Philosophers broke away from purely religious explanations, explored the potential of human reason, and laid the foundations for modern science and democracy. Their ideas about individual rights, social contracts, and human equality would go on to shape the world that we live in today. Next, we're going to move into the 19th century, where philosophy becomes more introspective, tackling questions of existence, morality, and human nature on an even deeper level. Let's keep going. As we step into the 19th century, philosophy becomes deeply introspective, moving beyond Enlightenment ideas of reason and progress to ask tougher, sometimes darker questions about existence, freedom, and the human condition. This era was one of rapid social and industrial change, and thinkers of the time responded by challenging established beliefs and exploring new, often radical ideas. So let's get into the major philosophical currents of the 19th century. One of the most influential thinkers of this era was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a German philosopher, that was a name, wasn't it? A German philosopher whose ideas would shape much of modern philosophy. Hegel introduced a new way of looking at reality through his concept of the dialectic, a process where history and ideas evolve through a dynamic of opposing forces. Think of it like this. For Hegel, every idea or thesis encounters its opposite, an antithesis. And the conflict between them produces a new, more advanced idea called the synthesis. This process is ongoing, and Hegel believed it was driving humanity toward greater freedom and self-understanding. In his view, history itself is rational, moving toward what he called the absolute, a state of ultimate knowledge and freedom. While Hegel's philosophy is complex, his idea of the dialectic would go on to influence many later thinkers, especially in political and social philosophy. Following Hegel, we have another giant of 19th century thought, Soren Kierkegaard, often considered the father of existentialism. Kierkegaard was deeply concerned with the individual's experience, particularly when it came to faith and personal choice. He believed that life is filled with uncertainty and that individuals must navigate this uncertainty on their own, making choices without guarantees of the right answer. This led him to focus on concepts like the leap of faith, the idea that faith requires a personal, sometimes irrational commitment in the face of doubt. Kierkegaard's focus on individual experience and the struggle for meaning laid the groundwork for existentialist thought, which would gain momentum in the 20th century. Then we have Karl Marx. I'm sure you've all heard of Karl Marx, whose ideas would ignite revolutions and shape political thought across the world. Marx was deeply critical of the industrial society that emerged in the 19th century. He saw capitalism as a system that exploited the working class, creating a divide between the bourgeoisie, the owners of production, and the proletariat, or working class. Marx argued that this division was inherently oppressive and that class struggle would eventually lead to the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a classless society. His most famous works, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, lay out his theory of historical materialism, the idea that economic conditions drive historical change. While Marx's ideas have sparked intense debate and controversy, his impact on social and political thought is undeniable. Then, of course, we come to one of my favourites, Friedrich Nietzsche, the most provocative thinker of the century, I believe. Nietzsche questioned many of the values that society took for granted, especially those tied to religion, morality, and truth. He famously declared that God is dead, suggesting that the decline of religious belief in the modern age had left a void in our understanding of purpose and morality. Nietzsche argued that traditional morals, which he called slave morality, were life-denying because they discouraged strength, creativity, and individual greatness. Instead, he called for the development of an Übermensch, or overman, an individual who creates their own values and lives beyond societal constraints. Nietzsche's ideas were revolutionary and controversial, challenging people to confront difficult questions about the foundations of morality and the meaning of life in a world without absolute values. While Marx and Nietzsche were dismantling social norms and religious values, other 19th century thinkers were exploring the limits of human knowledge and scientific understanding. John Stuart Mill, for instance, expanded on the idea of utilitarianism, the philosophy that actions are right if they promote happiness and wrong if they produce the opposite. Mill's version of utilitarianism emphasized individual rights and the harm principle, which says that people should be free to do as they wish so long as their actions don't harm others. Mill believed that personal liberty and social progress go hand in hand, and his ideas will become fundamental to liberal political theory. And then we have Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher whose work took a decidedly pessimistic view of human existence. Schopenhauer believed that life is driven by a blind, insatiable will, a kind of irrational force that compels all living things to survive and reproduce, but that ultimately leads to suffering. For Schopenhauer, life is filled with frustration because desire is endless and satisfaction fleeting. His ideas influenced existentialism by presenting a stark view of the human condition and encouraging people to find peace through detachment, aesthetics, and compassion. Interestingly, Schopenhauer's pessimism resonated with later existentialists who grappled with similar themes of suffering and the search for meaning. This was also a period when science was beginning to change the way we think about humanity and our place in the world. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection shook the philosophical and religious foundations of the time, suggesting that human beings were not specially created, but rather than part of an ongoing process of natural change. Darwin's ideas challenged philosophers to reconsider questions about human nature, morality, and our relationship with the natural world, sparking debates that continue today in both philosophy and science. So to sum that all up, the 19th century was a period of dramatic shifts in philosophy. Hegel's dialectics, Kierkegaard's existential questions, Marx's critique of capitalism, Nietzsche's rejection of traditional morality, and Schopenhauer's deeply bleak outlook on life. All of these ideas reflect a time of social upheaval and intellectual curiosity. These thinkers didn't just build on previous ideas, they challenged and transformed them, setting the stage for even deeper questions about existence and human potential. Up next, we enter the 20th century, where these ideas will evolve in surprising new directions. Let's keep going. As we enter the 20th century, philosophy splinters into a remarkable variety of schools and ideas. This was an era of rapid social, scientific, and technological change, and philosophers responded by challenging previous ideas in bold new ways. Unlike earlier periods, which often focused on grand theories of existence or morality, 20th century philosophy is incredibly diverse. So let's explore some of the most influential movements and thinkers from this period. We're starting with existentialism, a philosophy focused on individual experience, freedom, and the search for meaning in a world that often feels chaotic or indifferent. Existentialism really came into its own in the 20th century, thanks to thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence, meaning that we aren't born with a predetermined purpose. Instead, we create our own meaning through our actions. Sartre's view was that with total freedom comes total responsibility, much like Spider-Man. We alone are responsible for creating a meaningful life. Simone de Beauvoir, a key existentialist and feminist thinker, expanded on these ideas, particularly in relation to gender. In her groundbreaking work, The Second Sex, she argued that women have historically been defined as the other, constrained by societal expectations. For Beauvoir, true freedom involves breaking away from these expectations to define oneself authentically. Meanwhile, Albert Camus explored the concept of the absurd, the conflict between our desire for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference. Camus suggested that we confront this absurdity without surrendering to despair, a stance he called the absurd hero. His famous image of Sisyphus, a figure condemned to endlessly push a boulder up a hill, captures the resilience needed to live meaningfully in an often incomprehensible world. At the same time, a new movement called phenomenology was developing, led by German philosopher Edmund Husserl. Phenomenology focuses on describing our direct experiences or phenomena as they appear to consciousness. For Husserl, this meant setting aside assumptions and studying things as they present themselves to us. His student, Martin Heidegger, took these ideas even further, exploring what it means to be. Heidegger's work emphasized the concept of being in the world, seeing human existence as fundamentally tied to the world around us. Rather than seeing ourselves as isolated individuals, Heidegger suggested we're always engaged in relationships, actions, and experiences that define us. His ideas had a massive influence on existentialism and paved the way for many post-war philosophical movements. Across the English-speaking world, another approach to philosophy was taking hold. That's analytic philosophy. Pioneers like Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and G.E. Moore focused on clarity and precision, often using the tools of logic and language to tackle philosophical problems. For Russell and Wittgenstein, philosophy's task wasn't to provide grand theories about the world, but to clarify thoughts and solve puzzles about meaning. Wittgenstein's later work, in particular, focused on how language shapes our understanding, arguing that many philosophical problems stem from misunderstandings about how language works. This analytical approach had a huge influence on 20th century philosophy, especially in areas like philosophy of language, mind, and science. And then we have critical theory, a movement that emerged from the Frankfurt School in Germany, where philosophers like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse explored how power structures influence society and culture. Critical theorists were concerned with issues of oppression, ideology, and social control, and they argued that philosophy and social sciences should work towards social liberation. Adorno and Horkheimer, for example, critiqued the culture industry, suggesting that mass media and popular culture serve to reinforce dominant ideologies and distract people from questioning social injustices. Their ideas would go on to influence fields like sociology, political science, and media studies. Another influential movement in 20th century philosophy is postmodernism, which questions traditional ideas of objective truth, identity, and meaning. French thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard were instrumental in developing these ideas. Foucault's work focused on how power is embedded in social institutions like prisons, hospitals, and schools. He argued that knowledge and power are intertwined, shaping how we understand ourselves and others. Derrida, on the other hand, developed deconstruction, a method of reading texts that reveals contradictions and hidden assumptions, challenging the idea of fixed meanings. Postmodernists were skeptical of grand narratives or sweeping explanations of history and society, and instead emphasized the complexity and fluidity of reality. The 20th century also saw the rise of feminist philosophy, where thinkers like Beauvoir, as we mentioned, and later Judith Butler, examined how gender and identity are socially constructed. Butler's concept of gender as performance, suggesting that our gender identities are shaped by repeated actions and societal expectations, challenged traditional views on gender and opened up new ways of understanding identity, agency, and liberation. Feminist philosophy has since expanded to address intersectionality, exploring how race, gender, class, and other social factors intersect in complex ways to shape experience and opportunity. 20th century philosophy brought a remarkable diversity of thought. Existentialism and phenomenology explored the depths of human experience. Analytic philosophy sharpened our understanding of language and logic, and critical theory and postmodernism challenged power structures and questioned absolute truth. This era left us with a complex picture of humanity and knowledge, setting the stage for ongoing debates about mind, identity, and social justice in the 21st century. And we have finally arrived at the present day and are venturing into contemporary philosophy. Our philosophy today is more diverse and interdisciplinary than ever, tackling complex issues from ethics and technology to social justice, consciousness, and environmentalism. As the world changes, so too does philosophy, evolving to address the new questions and challenges that come with modern life. Let's dive into some of the most influential areas in contemporary philosophy. One of the most dynamic fields that's around today is the philosophy of mind, where philosophers grapple with questions about consciousness, identity, and artificial intelligence. The rise of neuroscience has added new depth to these debates as philosophers and scientists alike try to understand the nature of consciousness. David Chalmers, for instance, has continued to explore what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why and how subjective experiences arise from physical processes in the brain. This question remains one of the great mysteries in both philosophy and science, with implications for our understanding of human nature, free will, and even the ethics of creating conscious machines. Another area that's grown tremendously is ethics, especially as it relates to technology and bioethics. Philosophers are now debating issues that were once the realm of science fiction, like the ethics of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and even the possibility of human enhancement through technology. Thinkers like Nick Bostrom, a leading philosopher in transhumanism, explore scenarios in which humanity transcends its biological limitations, raising questions about identity, mortality, and what it means to be human. With rapid advancements in AI and biotechnology, questions about privacy, autonomy, and the nature of personhood are more pressing than ever. Contemporary philosophy is also deeply engaged with social and political philosophy, particularly around issues of justice, equity, and systemic oppression. The 20th century's critical theory has evolved into more modern forms, such as intersectionality and post-colonialism. Kimberlé Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, for example, examines how overlapping social identities like race, gender, and class create unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. Post-colonial philosophers like Gayatri Spivak and Frantz Fanon critique the lingering impacts of colonialism on identity, culture, and power, questioning Western assumptions and advocating for decolonization and cultural reclamation. These perspectives have expanded our understanding of justice, pushing us to consider how historical and social contexts shape individual experiences. One of the most fascinating recent developments is experimental philosophy, or XPhi, which uses empirical methods to investigate philosophical questions. Experimental philosophers conduct surveys and psychological studies to explore how people think about issues like morality, consciousness, and free will. By grounding philosophical questions in empirical data, they hope to bridge the gap between abstract theorizing and everyday beliefs, providing insights that are both philosophically rigorous and practically relevant. Finally, we have neo-pragmatism, an influential contemporary movement that draws on the pragmatism of philosophers like William James and John Dewey, but adapts it for the modern world. Thinkers like Richard Rorty argue that philosophy should focus less on seeking objective truth and more on creating concepts and tools that help us navigate and improve our lives. Rorty rejected the traditional search for foundational truths, suggesting instead that our ideas and values should be judged by their practical consequences. This pragmatic approach appeals to those who see philosophy as a means to solve real-world problems rather than uncover eternal truths. So, as we can see from that, contemporary philosophy is pretty diverse, pretty dynamic, and deeply engaged with the issues of our time. From the mysteries of consciousness to the ethics of AI, philosophy today is a field of active inquiry that continues to adapt and respond to the changing world. As we face unprecedented challenges and possibilities, contemporary philosophy reminds us that the big questions are far from settled. They are constantly evolving, inviting us all to think, to question, and to engage. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to say on our whirlwind tour of philosophical ideology, which I think was a little bit more than 30 minutes, but hey-ho, I did my besties. From the early questions of ancient thinkers to the diverse, often complex debates of today, we've seen how each era built upon the last, constantly reimagining what it means to seek truth, purpose, and understanding. And while the questions may have evolved, the spirit of inquiry remains the same. Philosophy reminds us that there's always more to explore, always new perspectives to consider, and always deeper questions that challenge us to think in fresh ways. Whether it's pondering the nature of reality, wrestling with ethical dilemmas, or considering the future of humanity, philosophy is, at its core, a conversation that never really ends. I'd like to thank all of you for joining me on this exploration of philosophy today. I hope that it's given you a better understanding, perhaps, of some of the key ideas through the ages and how they all relate to each other. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast, leaving us a review, or sharing it with your friends who might find it interesting. Your support obviously helps us to continue to bring you all this sort of content, and it lets us know what you like and what you don't like, so we can tailor it a bit better to suit your needs. As always, if anything in this episode has resonated with you in any way, then I would love to hear from you. I want to hear your beautiful voices. Share your stories with us via Patreon at patreon.com/theobservingeye. You can share things on our website at theobservingeye.com. That's new, that's happening now. Or we're on social media. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@theobservingeye and on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @theobservingeye as well. And there's also an email. You can email us at david@theobservingeye.com. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope it's been useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writing or work around psychology, philosophy, and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.com. And that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.